Okay, good afternoon. Welcome back. Technically, this is going to be a continuation of Lecture 12, which we covered on Thursday of last week, but I wanted to spend a bit more time on it, and because our syllabus, as you know, is not tied to dates, but to topics, I thought this was worth taking a bit more time on. That means we'll not get to the topic of the Asian death penalty until next week at this time, because on Thursday of this week, March 1st, will be the midterm for this class. If you're listening to this on webcast, then you can take the afternoon off. If you're in this class and taking it for credit, then you must decide that you should not take the afternoon off. In fact, you need to be here as much as possible on time. We've got roughly 90 minutes. You're going to face a 60-minute exam, so there's going to be some time getting you seated, handing it out. You're going to have 30 multiple choice questions to answer in 60 minutes. You're going to have the option of writing a one-sentence explanation for your answer if you want to for partial credit. So what you're going to need to bring with you is a pencil or pen, or a couple, in case they run out, a blue book or two, although I don't think you'll need to, in which to write your one-sentence explanations. You're going to be able to just circle your answer on the exam form itself, which I hope will help with the rather uncomfortable seating arrangement here. You won't need to be writing a lot. You'll be able to just basically be circling and maybe writing a brief explanation. There are going to be different versions of the exam. That is, they'll be the same questions, but they're going to be in different order. So if you notice your neighbor working on a question that looks different than yours, first of all, you shouldn't be noticing your neighbor's question. Second of all, don't be concerned that they seem to be answering a different exam, because they will be deliberately designed that way. So get here in a timely manner as possible on Thursday, and the exam will be handed out. Again, it'll cover materials essentially up to what we covered last week. Whatever I talk about today, other than if it repeats something we talked about last week, it won't be on the exam, although hopefully it'll be helpful to you in reviewing for the exam. So any questions? Hopefully you also got our paper memo, so if you're bored studying for the exam, you can start thinking about the paper. Yes? Well, I know I added 12 this morning, but there should have been 10 and 11 there. I'll double check that. Anyone else? Within broad outlines, I don't think you need to know, down to the decimal points. Within broad outlines, you ought to have some sense of the shifting patterns that we talked about in the 19th century with respect to especially the English experience, the American experience since the 70s. I think you want to have a sense of the broad outlines of that. Yes. Yes. That'll be you'll have 60 minutes in which to answer 30 questions. So, and that includes whatever time you need to take if you want to. You don't have to write an explanation. Only if you think that, for instance, if you're really uncertain of which of two and you want to hedge your bet a little bit, we'll give you that option for partial credit to explain your answer. So if you get what we think is the wrong one, but we can understand why you chose that, and we think you had partly the right idea, we can give you some credit for that. But we'll check to go back to you for a moment on the slides. Certainly want to make sure all of those are up. Maybe while somebody can be checking that, I can certainly get them up there. And of course, you can watch the webcast as well, but this will be a quicker solution. Other questions? Yes? Anything I talk about today that may reference or repeat something that we talked about last week, then that is on the exam. The stuff you had to read for last week, including the Roper case and et cetera, could be on the exam. So the material that we covered last week, this is essentially a continuation of Lecture 12. Anything new I say today or any new slides, material I put up that wasn't talked about last week won't be on the exam. So consider this more of a review than new material for purposes of the exam. Okay, so I just want to go back a little bit before where I ended last time to talk about this rather distinctive death penalty that has emerged in America since Gregg versus Georgia affirmed that there could be a constitutional death penalty in the United States, and a series of Supreme Court cases in the decades since then have continued to reaffirm that the death penalty is basically constitutional. So as we'll look at in a bit more detail today, in some cases they have carved out some exceptions to the death penalty, including people who are of subnormal intelligence, or sometimes called the retarded, as well as people who commit their crimes while they're juveniles. We'll talk a bit more about that. But by and large, the death penalty is now a legal. I hesitate to use the word normal because it's still it remains an extremely rare, outside of Texas and Virginia in particular, a rare kind of event. It's hardly normal in the sense that a prison sentence is normal, and yet it is no longer exceptional. People, the kind of attention that was paid to, for instance, the very first execution of Gary Gilmore back in 1976, which was the first execution following the moratorium that had taken place around the Furman case. There's nothing like that level of attention, and yet, as we saw last fall with the execution of Troy Davis down in Georgia, the death penalty continues to, if it's not at the top level of people's attention, it continues to be a rather dramatic and at times at least very controversial element. So I think it's helpful to take stock, and that's what I want to do today, of rather than simply asking the question of why hasn't the American death penalty disappeared on schedule the way it should appear to have following the pattern that we saw with Europe. I want to look at the death penalty as a distinctive, if somewhat different, modern approach to the death penalty. That is, Europe has abolished the death penalty as their modern approach to it. We have retained the death penalty, but in a very modified form, as well as talk about where what the future of the American death penalty is likely to be. And as I noted last time, you can make the case that the death penalty sort of works well in America. There are executions that garner a tremendous amount of public support, and which in many ways seem to satisfy the cravings that the death penalty offers to people, a sense of a wrongdoer who is unambiguously a bad actor, who appears to not be subject to the kind of excuses that give us pause, perhaps, whether because of mental illness or retardation, etc. Here's somebody who doesn't deny that they did the crime. It isn't particularly offering a defense of being, in some ways, unable to form the choice that they made. So in some ways, this was as good as the death penalty gets. When they did polling on the execution of Tim McVeigh, very high numbers of Americans supported it, higher than who support the death penalty. So it appears that lots of people who normally don't support the death penalty found it was okay to do it when it came to Tim McVeigh. So in some ways, again, it happened more quickly than a lot of executions do. He was executed, I believe, in 2001. For a crime that took place in 1995, so it was a relatively short span, partly because he was a sort of quasi-volunteer. We use the term volunteer for somebody who's given up some of their appeals. He sort of gave them up and then he changed his mind, and then so it could have gone on a lot longer, presumably. He had a very strong defense team. A lot of death penalty cases leave us with the very real concern that the people on death row are there not because they committed the worst crimes, but because they have the worst lawyers. Right? That's, at least at the trial level, that's a very real concern, especially in the South, where lawyers are often paid ridiculously low sums to represent capital defendants and, not surprisingly, prepare very weak cases. But Tim McVeigh is the best example we can give of sort of the death penalty as flourishing and healthy, and if we look at the historical pattern, at least up to the beginning of this century, we might imagine that the death penalty, after a period of doubt and reconsideration, is sort of coming back after Gregg versus Georgia, and perhaps Tim McVeigh's execution, which takes place just after this period. We might consider to be part of a longer-term pattern in which the death penalty is resuming its normality. But as I showed you last time, when we look further down the line, we see that executions have actually fallen off, and they've fallen off even more steeply since 2006, when this present chart ends. I also pointed out to you last time that the death penalty in America has become a remarkably sectional or regional phenomena, as opposed to pre-1930, when it was very much of a national phenomena. It today is mostly practiced in the South, which is where you see the largest figures here. For Texas, if you're looking since 1977. For Florida, my former home state, Virginia, it's not states like New York and California, which prior to Furman would have been the major executing states. Another example of the kind of failure of the death penalty to achieve kind of stable normality, in addition to the infrequency of its use, the fact that throughout the period, and this is the data is a little bit obscured in the slide, but this shows you basically removals and additions to death rows by number of inmate per year from 1977 to 2002. And what you see is that the number of people removed from death row by virtue of judicial action, basically a successful appeal, while you can see it goes up and down, if we were to draw a trend line there, it would be at least slightly upward. And that is, in some ways, very curious, because what it suggests is that the death penalty is not stabilizing, that it, after a period of being under attack and new rules being adopted, you might expect there to be sort of a period of trial, learning the new rules and eventually getting them right. But what we see is that the complexities of the death penalty don't go away, and that's partly because of the creation of the more intense lawyering that death cases receive, one of the due process developments that did occur after Furman versus Georgia in an attempt to make the death penalty more constitutionally adequate, and which may have resulted in the long run in a great deal of difficulty of the death penalty establishing itself as a truly executable penalty, as opposed to just giving sentences, which we can do. You can see admissions have been high, and although they've dropped off in recent years, but the removal tells you that a lot of these cases remain, legally speaking, very problematic. And of course, that creates what I think is in many ways the most distinctive feature of the modern death penalty in America, which is the massive death row. To be sentenced to death in America today is not so much to be sentenced to be killed by the state; it's to be sentenced to be held by the state in a permanent form of imprisonment, in which attempts to get paroled, etc., are replaced by attempts to keep yourself from being executed, but in which the fact that you are imprisoned remains the overwhelming fact, and in which a bigger and bigger population of people are being held by the states in a long-term status of condemned prisoner, which is a unique feature in history. And historically, you waited, back in the Tyburn days, you waited a few months before you were executed at the next assize of the courts. And as late as the 50s in California, you would have waited maybe a year from your trial to your eventual execution, about a year. Now we're waiting 25 or 30 years in California, and it doesn't look very likely to change very much. And that is very different. Whatever one might think of a death penalty in which somebody is sentenced to die and actually executed, a penalty in which somebody is sentenced to die, is in prison for a quarter century or more, and then executed, is arguably a very different and perhaps crueler penalty. And we can see that as a result of perhaps this not altogether satisfying form, as well as some of the other contemporary developments that we'll talk about, support for the death penalty having rallied, in the period up to Furman, support for the death penalty had been declining and then sort of began to revive again. By the mid-90s, as you can see, it was near its peak. Historically, you had over 80% of Americans supporting the death penalty, so there's not a lot of, can't go too much higher than that. I mean, there's bound to be 18% of the public that disagrees on almost any issue, so you're kind of close to your natural, close to unanimity as you can imagine any issue obtaining in America. And then over the next 20 years, that is eroded considerably to the point where there may only be a 15 or 16% difference between proponents and opponents. And by the way, that's just on the basic question, do you support the death penalty in principle? When you ask people, would you still support the death penalty if the alternative was life in prison without parole, and if the capital or the life without parole sentenced murderer was required to work in prison for restitution to the victim, if you condition it that way, you get close to a 50-50 split, or maybe even slightly more against the death penalty than for it. So are we in the end game of the death penalty? I think the short answer is obviously nobody knows. We could clearly have the very odd but nonetheless real death penalty that we have now just continue for the rest of my life and well into yours. But the arguments, the battle over the death penalty in some ways is not dying down. If anything, it's heating up. As I've pointed out a couple of times, we're going to have a voter initiative here in California in November, very likely, on the death penalty, whether to repeal it. This will be historic. As you saw, the Supreme Court in Gregg versus Georgia actually cited California's voter initiative to restore the death penalty as strong evidence of contemporary moral standards regarding the death penalty. If California voters eliminate the death penalty in November of 2012, given that history, I think that will be a very important and interesting event in its own right as an indicator of changing values about the death penalty. In some ways, the debate about the death penalty is relentlessly repetitive. These arguments from an ACLU pamphlet could have been made by Beccaria. These are the kind of standard arguments about cruelty, archaicness, lack of penological validity. But you also see a new abolitionism, arguably. One issue is the issue which I've highlighted here with this quote from a report on death penalty polling that indicates that concern about wrongful conviction has helped to erode support for the death penalty, and that's an issue I want to come back to in a moment. But it's possible, and this is a phrase, new abolitionism, that comes from political scientist Austin Serrett, whose work I've recommended to you. And what Serrett points out that I think is worth noting here is that in addition to these traditional classic arguments about the death penalty, what we see are in some ways a new set of arguments that are emerging from the post-Furman, post-Gregg death penalty in its new legalized state. Right? When opponents of the death penalty took the death penalty to court in Furman versus Georgia, they not only moved America and attempted to move America toward abolitionism, they also moved the American death penalty into a more intensively legal domain. Now you might say, well, how did the death penalty get more legal? It was already a legal sentence handed down by courts, etc. But as we saw in Furman itself, one of the biggest arguments against the death penalty is that it was too arbitrary and capricious, that it wasn't law-like enough in its factual performance. It might have been legal in terms of a statute authorizing it for a particular crime, but if it was actually applied the way lightning strikes individuals with no rhyme or reason, then it clearly didn't fit a deeper sense of legality. While the death penalty was upheld by the Supreme Court as meeting these more demanding legal standards in Gregg and ever since, you could argue that the surviving death penalty is one that is permanently hobbled by questions about its legal validity. So one kind of question that remains deeply problematic for state killing in the United States is the question of racial discrimination. Right? McCluskey turned that claim away, refused to take the evidence there that there was at least strong statistical evidence of a pattern of racial bias in the death sentence, and they decided that that was not sufficient to show the kind of evidence of specific racial discriminatory intent in the actual case of McCleskey, a standard that almost no evidence short of a confession by the prosecutor that they were motivated by racial bias could possibly reach. But the Supreme Court turned that away there, but that doesn't mean that the issue has gone away. I would suggest to you that concern that the death penalty is racially biased is one of the reasons that Troy Davis's execution was so troubling to so many people, even though the crime was a very heinous crime. The fact that the police officer there was white and Troy Davis was African American, combined with concerns about whether he was the right person who did the crime, helped to very much raise doubts about the validity of Georgia's death penalty in that case. There's also, even beyond the racial discrimination, which is its own very special kind of lawlessness, there's a kind of taint of lawlessness to the contemporary death penalty that you see, and we talked about it in the very first week in the class, the unseemly way in which the state often has to behave in order to carry out death sentences, frustrating the efforts of courts, for instance, to hold them accountable for how they chose their lethal injection drugs. In the Sims case that we looked at back in the very first week of class, where you had the California Supreme Court castigating the Attorney General of California for lying to the Supreme Court in a brief about when they had formulated their new policy on how execution should be carried out. And I underline that not to make fun of the Attorney General or to suggest that Attorney Generals are, don't understand the law, but just to point out that, when the state's highest legal official it apparently lies to the state's highest court in order to facilitate the carrying out of the state's ultimate penalty, the overall legal legitimacy of the whole system is put into question in a way by the death penalty. Even though, as we saw going back to Foucault, the whole point of the death penalty is to shore up, at least one point of the death penalty is to shore up the legitimacy of the state. And I think one thing you have to say about the contemporary American death penalty is it doesn't do much for the state. It may do something for victims, it may do something for police officers' unions or other groups that feel a strong sense of identity with the death penalty, but what we're interested in doing is building respect for the state as a legal institution. The death penalty arguably has not been very helpful. Now, as we began talking about last time, although the Supreme Court has made very clear that they're not going to revisit the overall question of the constitutionality of the death penalty, and in particular whether the death penalty is cruel and unusual punishment for purposes of the Eighth Amendment, they have begun, and we don't know whether they're done, because there's at least one more category they could turn to, but they've begun to carve out whole categories of individuals for whom it would be cruel and unusual punishment to execute them. And let's just revisit this. I asked you to read an excerpted version of the Roper case, which very much tracks Adkins, which was the case about the retarded. These are both examples of how the court uses the Eighth Amendment when it assesses the validity of the death penalty. As we've seen, the Eighth Amendment has various different values that it protects when it comes to punishment. It protects against torture, something that was many people believe was the primary historical reason for the Eighth Amendment to be written as it was about cruel and unusual punishment. It protects against arbitrary and capricious punishments, even if they're not tortuous, which was a holding in Furman versus Georgia itself. And it also assures that punishments, even if they were acceptable at the time the Eighth Amendment was framed in the late 18th century, nonetheless, if they become incompatible with what the court has called evolving standards of decency, what you might think of as our sense of dignity, what human dignity requires, that if that evolution takes place, that the court can use the Eighth Amendment to strike down death sentences, even if state legislatures have continued to support them. If we look at Roper versus Simmons, you have a nice example there of how the court does this kind of analysis. So one thing they look to, they've said already in Gregg versus Georgia that the death penalty is overall acceptable to contemporary American values, and they cited the 35 states, that had reenacted the death penalty following Furman versus Georgia. But when you look at particular examples like the retarded or juveniles, the court is prepared to examine whether there has been sufficient change about those categories to warrant considering an Eighth Amendment bar on their execution. In both these cases, that's what you found. You had earlier decisions in the 80s, the Thompson case, which first found that you can't execute people for crimes committed under the age of 16, and then Sanford, where they said, but you can execute people who are 18 or 17. Both of those cases looked to the pattern of state law. What were the states that have the death penalty doing? The key finding for the Supreme Court on this issue of evolving standards in Roper is the fact that compared to the 1980s, when something like 20 of the death penalty states, there's about 35 death penalty states, so a clear majority of death penalty states permitted somebody to be executed who was under the age of 18, who was, say, 18 or 17 when they committed the crime. 17 or 16 when they committed the crime, under the age of 18. By the time they looked at it again in Roper versus Simmons, about half a dozen of those states had switched, had eliminated the death penalty for juveniles. So that it goes to what the court has called the objective dimension of the Eighth Amendment decency analysis. Is there a trend in the states that would indicate that a particular punishment is coming to seem more unacceptable than it had in the past? But that's not the end of the analysis. The court then has to decide on sort of its own grounds whether there is adequate proportionality between the punishment and the crime. Again, they have said that in general, it's proportionate. The death penalty for murder is proportionate, and they talked about retribution and deterrence as the two penal rationales that support that fit, essentially finding that there are cases where the death penalty either deters more effectively than life imprisonment would or provides retributive justice more effectively. Here they ask the same kind of question about juveniles, and they come up with a different answer. They basically find that because of the diminished mental capacity of juveniles, their limited cognitive development, their well-established and documented difficulty in considering future consequences of their present action, that neither deterrence or retribution is satisfied when juveniles kill. That is, their development of their rational calculating capacity is insufficient to think that they can be deterred by the threat of death. And that same level of cognitive lack of development suggests that they're less responsible, less culpable of the crimes that they've committed, and therefore they don't meet the retributive demand as heavily. And putting those two together, the pattern among the states and the emerging evidence of real cognitive differences between juveniles and adults when it comes to both deterrence and retribution, the court concludes in Roper versus Simmons that the death penalty for juveniles, that is for anyone under the age of 18, would be cruel and unusual punishment. Now,